First of all, I'd like to welcome everybody to the third annual Platypus Affiliated Society International Convention. We're happy this year to have a number of guest speakers who've come in from various locations out of town, as well as a lot of participants who also traveled from out of town, for which we're grateful. I'm just going to introduce the convention, and then I'm going to turn it over to Jeremy, who will introduce the panel for this evening. So what we have in terms of public events this weekend, in addition to this opening plenary panel tonight, we also have a number of events tomorrow starting at 10 o'clock a.m. We have a series of workshops by their presentations from various left organizations, sort of giving their program and perspective on the left today from their various organizational points of view. And that's from 10 a.m. till 12 noon. There'll be two sets of concurrent sessions, one from 10 to 11, the other from 11 to 12. We'll have a lunch break. We're going to be providing lunch and dinner tomorrow to all the participants in the convention. Then starting at 1 o'clock, we're going to have a series of panel discussions on Marxism and the bourgeois revolution, Marxism and sexual liberation, Badu and post-Maoism, Marxism and communism today, art, culture, and politics, Marxist approaches, the Marxism of the Second International Radicals, and finally, Marxism and political philosophy. Then after the dinner break, we'll be resuming over at the 280 South Columbus Drive building of the School of the Art Institute, just a couple of blocks away, in the main auditorium, where we're going to be having a plenary at 7:30 on the legacy of Trotskyism. Finally, on Sunday morning from 11 a.m. to 12:30 p.m., back here in the ballroom of this building here, we'll have our closing plenary, which is titled, What is the Platypus Critique?, where we'll be talking about our own project. So without further ado, let's start tonight's event.
Hi, I'm Jeremy Cohen. I'm a graduate student at NYU in sociology, and I'm very pleased to be here tonight to introduce and to moderate this panel on the politics of critical theory. I'm going to read the description of the panel and then introduce you to our panelists. Recently, the New Left Review published a translated conversation between the critical theorists Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer, causing more than a few murmurs and gasps. In the course of their conversation, Adorno comments that he had always wanted to, quote, develop a theory that remains faithful to Marx, Engels, and Lenin, while keeping up with culture at its most advanced. Adorno, it seems, was a Leninist. As surprising as this evidence might have been to some, is it not more shocking that Adorno's politics and the politics of critical theory have remained taboo for so long? Was it really necessary to wait until Adorno and Horkheimer admitted their politics in print to understand that their primary preoccupation was with maintaining Marxism's relation to bourgeois critical philosophy, Kant and Hegel? This panel proposes to state the question as directly as possible and to simply ask, how did the practice and theory of Marxism, from Marx to Lenin, make possible and necessary the politics of critical theory? We're very honored to have several distinguished panelists to sort of take us into this discussion. Starting will be Dr. Andrew Feenberg. He studied with Herbert Marcuse and taught for many years in San Diego. He's currently at Vancouver at the Simon Fraser University and a teacher in the Philosophy of Technology program. He's written several books on the May events in France in 1968, on Lukács, and several on Marcuse, of which we have a few here: The Essential Marcuse, Selected Writings of Philosopher and Social Critic, and Heidegger and Marcuse, The Catastrophe and Redemption of History. And if people are interested in the books and in Dr. Feenberg's work in general, you're welcome to come up after the event to speak to him. Next, we'll have Richard Westerman, who is a postdoc at University of Chicago, who is studying Lukács and in general doing work on consciousness and social ontology in Lukács and in early 20th century German critical philosophy. Finally, we have Chris Cutrone as our panelist, who is an adjunct assistant professor at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, a PhD candidate at the University of Chicago who studies Adorno and Adorno's politics and Adorno's Leninism, and is also a founder of the Platypus Affiliated Society. Finally, we have Nicholas Brown as the respondent. He is the head of African American Studies at UIC, the president of the Marxist Literary Group, and editor of the journal Mediations. So each panelist is going to give their prepared remarks. We're going to have Nicholas Brown respond, then we'll have back and forth between the panelists. They'll have a chance to respond to each other. We'll open it up to Q&A more generally. Without further ado, I will give the mic over to Dr. Feenberg.
Thank you. Can you all hear me? Is that loud enough? Good. Okay. So this talk is called Waiting for History, Horkheimer and Adorno's Theater of the Absurd. In 2010, the New Left Review translated and published a dialogue between Horkheimer and Adorno on a new manifesto. This dialogue, which took place in 1956, is only understandable against the background of Marx and Lukács's interpretation of the theory-practice relation. In this talk, I will try and explain how that background blocks the production of the manifesto and reduces the discussion of it to absurdity. But first, let me show how Adorno and Horkheimer set up the problem. Their dialogue is a strange document. The pretension to update the Communist Manifesto is astonishing, particularly given the silliness of much of the talk. What are we to make of the first exchanges on the misplaced love of work? Horkheimer says, quote, "That's how it is among the bourgeoisie. This was not the attitude of the Greeks. The young worker on the motorbike treats work as his god because he enjoys riding the bike so much." Presumably, the young worker confuses the joy of motorbike riding with the job that earns him the money to buy a motorbike. Adorno replies, "But even if he really does enjoy it, that subjective happiness still remains ideology." Horkheimer, "But if you were to tell him about our idea that it is supposed to be enjoyable, he would find that hard to understand and would rather we left him in peace." Adorno, "All that is delusion." Horkheimer, "Yes and no. It really does call for a great effort." Adorno, "So does motorbike riding." Horkheimer, "That is an objectively measurable effort. He is happy to make it. His true pleasure in motorbike riding is the anal sounds it emits. We just look foolish if we try to give explanations that are too precise." End quote. This kind of talk is related to the question of what to say in a time when nothing can be done. The communist movement is dead, killed off by its own grotesque success in Russia and China. Western societies are still better than these Marxist alternatives. Horkheimer is convinced that the world is mad and that even Adorno's modest hope that things might work out someday stinks of theology. Horkheimer remarks, "We probably have to start from the position of saying to ourselves that even if the party no longer exists, the fact that we are here still has a certain value. In sum, the only evidence that something better is possible is the fact that they are sitting there talking about the possibility of something better." Horkheimer asks, in this situation, quote, "In whose interest do we write? People might say that our views are just all talk, our own perceptions. To whom shall we say these things?" And he continues, "We have to actualize the loss of the party by saying, in effect, that we are just as bad off as before, but we are playing on the instrument the way it has to be played today." And Adorno replies, "There's something seductive about that idea, but what is the instrument?" Although Adorno modestly remarks at one point that he has, quote, "the feeling that what we are doing is not without its effect," end quote, Horkheimer is more skeptical. He says, "My instinct is to say nothing if there is nothing I can do." And he goes on to discuss the tone and content of the manifesto in such a way as to reduce it to absurdity. Quote, "We want the preservation for the future of everything that has been achieved in America today, such as the reliability of the legal systems, the drugstores, etc. This must be made quite clear whenever we speak about such matters." And Adorno replies, "That includes getting rid of TV programs when they are rubbish." In 1955, shortly before this brilliant exchange occurred, Samuel Beckett wrote Waiting for Godot. The speculations of Vladimir and Estragon anticipate Max and Teddy's absurdist dialogue. And they even anticipate Horkheimer and Adorno's inflated self-estimate. Vladimir says, for instance, quote, "Let us not waste our time in idle discourse. Let us do something while we have the chance. It is not every day that we are needed, but at this place, at this moment of time, all mankind is us, whether we like it or not. Let us make the most of it before it is too late." End quote. This introduction to the discussion of Horkheimer and Adorno's text may seem unfair. Do they deserve my mockery? Yes and no, to quote Horkheimer. In one sense, their text is already self-mocking. The light-hearted tone of many of the exchanges shows them to be well aware of the literal impossibility of carrying out their project. The obstacle is their conception of the relation of theory to practice. On this topic, they get serious. Adorno points out that Marx and Hegel reject abstract ideals and reconstruct the concept of the ideal as the next historical step. This means that theory must be tied to practice, to real historical forces. As Horkheimer later puts the point, reality should be measured against criteria whose capacity for fulfillment can be demonstrated in a number of already existing concrete developments in historical reality. But, Adorno argues, Marx and Hegel did not live in a world like ours in which the next step could actually realize utopia, and yet no one wants to take that step. Under these conditions, the temptation to utopian speculation returns, but the pressure to meet the Hegelian Marxist historical desideratum blocks the further progress of thought. Horkheimer poses a dilemma in two contradictory propositions, saying, on the one hand, our thoughts are no longer a function of the proletariat, and on the other hand, that theory is theory in the authentic sense only where it serves practice. Theory that wishes to be sufficient unto itself is bad theory. This yields what Horkheimer calls a curious waiting process, and Adorno replies, in the best of case, theory as a message in a bottle. Horkheimer concludes the discussion much like Vladimir with the grim words, because we are still permitted to live, we are under an obligation to do something. What is most peculiar about this exchange is the refusal of these two philosophers to derive a critical standard from philosophical reflection once history can no longer supply it. This is what Habermas would do later, admit the breakdown of the Hegelian Marxist historical approach and establish a properly philosophical basis for critique. If no next step lights the way, perhaps ethics can do the job in its place. But Horkheimer and Adorno insist on the importance of situating their thought historically. No wonder the dialogue wavers between the comic and the portentous. How did Marxism end up in such a bind? As I mentioned at the outset, I believe this question leads back to Marx and Lukács. Lukács's book, History and Class Consciousness, contained the most influential reflection on the relation of theory and practice in the Marxist tradition. He renewed the Hegelian Marxist historical critique of abstract ideals, which underlies the dilemma at the heart of the dialogue. Lukács introduces the problem of theory and practice through a critique of an early text in which Marx demands that theory seize the masses. That's a quote from Marx, that theory must seize the masses. But Lukács argues, if theory seizes the masses, it stands in an external relation to their own needs and intentions. It would be a mere accident if the masses accomplish theoretical goals. Rather, theory must be rooted in the needs and intentions of the masses if it is to be really and truly the theory of their movement and not an alien imposition. Lukács takes up this theme at a more abstract level in his critique of Kantian ethics. In Lukács's terms, the antinomy of theory and practice is an example of the more general antinomy of value and fact, ought and is. These antinomies arise from a formalistic concept of reason in terms of which theory and practice are alien to each other. This concept of reason fails to discover in the given facts of social life those potentialities and tendencies leading to a rational end. Instead, the given is conceived as fundamentally irrational, as merely empirical. Lukács explains, quote, precisely in the pure classical expression it received in the philosophy of Kant, it remains true that the ought presupposes an existing reality to which the category of ought remains inapplicable in principle, end quote. This is the dilemma of bourgeois thought. Political rationality presupposes as its material substratum an irrational social existence, hostile to rational principles. The rational realm of citizenship, illuminated by moral obligation, stands in stark contradiction to the crude world of civil society based on animal need and the struggle for existence. But if this is true of bourgeois theory, what of the theory of the proletarian movement? Is Marxism just a disguised ethical exigency opposed to the natural tendencies of the species? This is the flaw of heroic versions of communism, which oppose morality to life. Demanding sacrifice for the party, the next generation, the workers, conforms precisely to the bourgeois pattern Lukács criticizes. This is not Marx. Starting from the Hegelian critique of abstract ethics, the early Marx arrived at a general concept of revolutionary theory as the reflection of life in thought. There is, for example, a letter to Ruge in which he writes, "Until now, the philosophers had the solution to all the riddles in their desks, and the stupid outside world simply had to open its mouth so that the roasted pigeons of absolute science might fly into it." End quote. Instead, philosophy must proceed from actual struggles in which the living contradiction of ideal and real appears. The new philosopher must, quote, explain to the world its own acts. He must show that actual struggles contain a transcending content that can be linked to a concept of a rational social life. So Marx writes, "We simply show the world why it struggles in reality, and the consciousness of this is something which it is compelled to acquire, even if it does not want to. The critic, therefore, can start with any form of theoretical and practical consciousness and develop the true actuality out of the forms inherent in the existing actuality as its ought to be and goal." This is what Horkheimer meant by his remark that society must be measured against concrete developments in historical reality. As Marx put it in another essay, it is not enough that thought should seek to realize itself. Reality must also strive toward thought. Marx's later writings are ambiguous, conserving only traces of this reflexive theory of consciousness, as, for example, in a brief passage in the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte. There he explains that the political and literary representatives of the petty bourgeoisie are related to the class by, quote, the fact that in their minds they do not get beyond the limits which the latter, the petty bourgeoisie, do not get beyond in life, that they are consequently driven theoretically to the same problems and solutions to which material interest and social position drives the latter practically. This passage invites revision to say that the proletariat, too, confronts problems that are solved theoretically by Marxism in a way that reflects the similar practical solution to which its life circumstances drive the class. Unfortunately, the later Marx did not make such an application of this suggestive remark. He left open the question of the relation of Marxist theory to proletarian class consciousness. This is Lukács' central question. He needs to show that Marxism is not related in a merely accidental manner to the thought and actions of proletarians, that it is not a scientific consciousness from without, which the proletariat would serve as a passive material base, but that it is essentially rooted in the life of the class. He proposed his much misunderstood theories of reification and class consciousness for this purpose. Reification is not an ideology or belief, as some commentators argue, but rather the form in which the social world is given immediately to the consciousness of all members of a capitalist society. Lukács writes that, quote, in capitalist society, reality is immediately the same for the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. The proletariat shares with the bourgeoisie the reification of every aspect of its life, end quote. However, the experience of reification differs depending on class situations. Accordingly, Lukács remarks that where the capitalist perceives something like, say, the lengthening of the workday as a matter of increasing the quantity of labor power purchased at a given price, for the worker, this quantity changes into quality. The worker goes beyond the reified quantitative determinants immediately given in the reified form of objectivity of his labor, because he cannot ignore the real qualitative degradation of life and health associated with them. Thus, quote, the quantitative differences in exploitation, which appear to the capitalist in the form of quantitative determinants of the objects of his calculation, must appear to the worker as the decisive qualitative categories of his whole physical, mental, and moral existence, end quote. The proletariat sees beyond immediacy in the act of becoming socially self-conscious. This self-consciousness penetrates beneath the reified form of its objects to their reality. This more or less spontaneous critique of reification gives rise to everyday practices which can be developed into the basis of a revolutionary movement by union and party organizations. Lukács thus claims that the workers' response to reification of experience under capitalism is the foundation on which Marxist dialectics arise. In a sense, one could say that Marxism and the proletariat share a similar method, a method for demystifying the reified appearances, but each in its own way, the one at the level of theory, the other at the levels of consciousness and practice. Where the theory shows the relativity of the reified appearances to deeper social structures, workers live that relativity in resisting the imposition of the reified capitalist economic forms on their own lives. Both theory and practice lead to a critique of the economic and epistemological premises of capitalism. As Marx himself writes in Capital, quote, "So far as such criticism represents a class, it can only represent the class whose vocation in history is the overthrow of the capitalist mode of production and the final abolition of all classes, the proletariat." Marx and Lukács established the methodological horizon of Marxism for the Frankfurt School. This is the background against which Horkheimer and Adorno discuss their new manifesto. They accept the critique of pure theory, but now that the proletariat no longer supports a transcending critique of society, any concession to practice drags theory back into the realm of everyday political wheeling and dealing. There appears to be no way out of the trap set by the tension between norm and history now that the revolution has failed. To return to the roasted pigeons of absolute science, that is to some sort of utopian or transcendental thinking, is now impossible. But there is no way to articulate the next step of history toward a better world. As Adorno remarks, what is the meaning of practice if there is no longer a party? In that case, doesn't practice mean either reformism or quietism? So I'm almost finished. Is there no alternative within the Marxist framework? In fact, there is an excluded alternative, occasionally evoked in the course of the dialogue. This alternative is referred derisively to Marcuse, who hovers like Banquo's ghost over the conversation. Adorno comes closest to articulating this position and is pulled back by Horkheimer each time. At one point, Adorno remarks, "I cannot imagine a world intensified to the point of insanity without objective oppositional forces being unleashed." This will turn out to be the thesis Marcuse hints at in One-Dimensional Man, and develops a bit later when those forces have appeared in books such as an essay on liberation. But Horkheimer rejects this view as overly optimistic. A bit later, Adorno refuses to accept that human nature is inherently evil. People only become Khrushchevs because they keep getting hit over the head. Horkheimer replies, "That is exactly Herbert Marcuse's position." Attributing the evil humans do to the repression they suffer holds open a certain hope in a less repressive future. But Horkheimer rejects hope and even ridicules Marcuse by claiming he expects a Russian Bonaparte to save the day and make everything right. Finally, there is a passage in which Adorno seems to be seeking an appropriate style for the manifesto. This is a bit rough because Gretel Adorno, who's writing all this down, I guess got behind. He says, "You have to find the point that wounds, offending against sexual taboos." And Horkheimer immediately calls him to order. "Marcuse, take care." What are we to make of this ghostly presence of a Marcusean alternative? It seems to me that these remarks already anticipate and condemn Marcuse's openness to the return of the movement in the form of the New Left. Where Adorno and Horkheimer ultimately rejected the New Left, Marcuse took the Hegelian, Marxian, Lukácsian plunge back into history. Marcuse was well aware that the New Left was no equivalent of Marx's proletariat, but he tried to find in it a hint of those objective oppositional forces of which Adorno spoke in 1956. In this way, theory might be related once again to practice without concession to the existing society, although also with no certainty of success. Much to Marcuse's surprise, on his 80th birthday, Beckett published a short poem as a tribute to him. The poem recognizes the obstinacy required by the seemingly impossible demands of the Frankfurt School's stance toward history. Here is the poem. It's in French. Pas à pas, nulle part, nul seul ne sait comment, petit pas, nulle part, obstinément. In English, step by step, nowhere, not a single one knows how, tiny steps, nowhere, stubbornly. Okay.
Next, we have Richard Westerman.
Thank you. The two foundational texts of critical theory, Georg Lukács's History and Class Consciousness and Karl Korsch's Marxism and Philosophy, were the products of a crisis in European Marxism. Both published in 1923, they represented a response to both failed and successful revolutions. Whilst the Bolsheviks had taken control of Russia, despite its relative underdevelopment, communist governments in Hungary and Germany had rapidly been toppled due to a lack of popular support. Notably, both Lukács and Korsch had served in these governments. Lukács himself had been on the front lines with the Hungarian Red Army. Though memorably condemned as Marxism of the philosophers by the nascent Soviet orthodoxy, the deeply philosophical readings of Marx that Korsch and Lukács developed were very much the product of their personal involvement in and response to practical revolutionary situations. But the fact that these books were written, as Lukács himself puts it, as, quote, attempts arising out of actual work for the party to clarify the theoretical problems of the revolutionary movement, end quote, is usually forgotten. This is shown in the reception of his central concept of reification. Very loosely, reification describes a social pathology in which individuals understand society and social relations through fixed, unalterable laws, with the result that they feel isolated and unable to change society. It's usually, and I'd say wrongly, assumed that Lukács's proposed solution is some updated version of German idealism, according to which the proletariat suddenly realizes that it's the creator of this objective world, and so spontaneously reappropriates its creation to free itself. As a result, Lukács's account of the role of the party in the final essay of History and Class Consciousness is read through this misinterpretation of reification, and he's wrongly accused of paving the way for a centralized state controlled by an authoritarian party. On this standard interpretation, Lukács apparently believes that because the proletariat hadn't realized it was the subject of history, the Revolutionary Party simply needed to tell it that this was the case, and if that didn't work, to act for them. He's seen as endorsing a centralist, Blanquist party that might easily deteriorate into post-revolutionary dictatorship. Surprisingly few of Lukács's interpreters have recognized that he actually envisages a much more democratic party. I'm pleased to be sharing a platform with one of them tonight, Andrew Feenberg. And I think the central reason for this common misrepresentation is a failure to understand adequately what exactly Lukács means by this central concept of reification and the way it shapes his theory of party organization. Most interpretations of Lukács think reification is a mistake made by a thinking subject, even if they then explain that mistake through various social causes. The party would then try to correct this mistake. Reification does not, however, describe a mere epistemological error. From the outset, it describes a type of praxis. Lukács's party isn't there to play the role of a wise leader to guide the proletariat. It's there to provide a locus for genuinely de-reified and thus de-reifying praxis. Rather than the Blanquist cadre of professional revolutionaries, Lukács's party is essentially a more institutionalized version of Rosa Luxemburg's general strike. To explain why I think this is the case, I'm going to start by tracing the roots of the problem Lukács is trying to solve, all the way back to Marx's critique of the distinction between state and civil society in On the Jewish Question, and I'll show how this problem could clearly not be solved by a vanguardist party. I'll then consider Lukács's own position. I'm going to argue that his vision of the party sits somewhere between Lenin and Rosa Luxemburg, in that he sees the formal organization provided by the party as still essential for real proletarian class consciousness. Finally, I'll suggest a couple of ways in which this might provide a model for the sort of democratic activity that could provide a counterweight to existing social and political structures. Written in response to Bruno Bauer's pamphlet on the question of full Jewish emancipation within the German state, Marx's On the Jewish Question radically reinterprets the meaning of social freedom. Arguing that the secularization of the state would only mean the reproduction of religious division at the level of society, Marx questioned the very division of state and civil society that had been central to Hegelian political thought. For Hegel, civil society was the realm of particular satisfaction and immediate social unity, the individuals tied to other individuals through an economic system of needs, rationalized through some fundamental social institutions built around this basic necessity. In contrast, Hegel saw the state as the realm of rational freedom, in which citizens are united as rational universal individuals. For Marx, this remains an alienated form of freedom. First, it meant that political form seemed to come from an impersonal universal force of reason rather than free human action. And second, it treated the categories of social existence as invariable, necessary, and open only to knowledge, not change. Marx proposed, therefore, that we bring heaven down to earth and make society itself into the realm of freedom by transforming the very relations of society. Real freedom thus means collective control of some sort over these relations. It's this sort of freedom, I think, that Lukács sees in party activity. But I think it should be obvious at once why a party that sought to carry out revolution on behalf of the proletariat would be unable to realize it. Such a party would reduce the working class to the role of spectators, remaining just as unfree as before, while the all-wise party did what they alone could see was necessary. In fact, Lukács is extremely clear in his rejection of such a top-down party, and it's hard to see how a rigorous reading could come up with any other conclusion. He states explicitly that, quote, even in theory, the Communist Party does not act on behalf of the proletariat, end quote, lest it reduces the masses to, quote, a merely observing, contemplative, end quote, attitude that leads to, quote, the voluntaristic overestimation of the active significance of the individual or leader and the fatalistic underestimation of the significance of the class or masses. And he repeatedly uses the word reification to caution against fixing any one organizational form and insulating it from criticism or change by the masses. Lukács could not be more clear. A top-down proto-Stalinist party would represent a return to the lack of freedom of capitalist society. In contrast, as Andrews noted elsewhere, Lukács draws heavily on Rosa Luxemburg, perhaps a rather unusual tactic in 1922, when the success of the Bolsheviks seemed to indicate a clear victory for Lenin's idea of a disciplined cadre of professional revolutionaries. Luxemburg had, in contrast, tried to minimize the role of the party. The general strike in which she vested such hopes was supposed to bring about the spontaneous development of class consciousness by forcing all strata of the working class into organizing themselves. Luxemburg's party plays a very secondary role. It's little more than a sort of secretarial role and certainly no kind of leadership. Nevertheless, Lukács repeatedly and effusively praises Luxemburg for her insights. He explicitly endorses her criticisms of Western European parties who underestimated mass action and thought only an educated party was ready to assume leadership. However, he suggests that she makes the opposite mistake in going too far and criticizes her for, as he puts it, underplaying the role of the party in the revolution. As is already clear, he doesn't think this role entails leadership in a conventional sense. So to understand what he means properly, I think we need to look a little more closely at his definition of reification. As I mentioned earlier, most interpretations of Lukács take reification to be an epistemological error. The problem they think Lukács identifies is that the categories that capitalist society is construed in are too abstract and formal. As a result, they think his project is only to replace such categories with more substantial ones that accurately reflect the qualitative underlying reality. Unfortunately, this interpretation doesn't withstand a close reading of the text. Reification, Verdinglichung, thingification, doesn't refer just to a problem of abstraction, merely of quantity opposed to a qualitative substrate, but rather to the undialectical ossification of forms as things that cannot be changed. This is clear enough in the central essay of the book, Reification and the Consciousness of the Proletariat. Here, Lukács presents an interpretation of what he calls bourgeois philosophy, above all the classical German thought of Kant, Fichte, and Hegel. The problem he identifies is the epistemological preoccupation of such philosophy. It starts from the separation of subject and object, and therefore has as its central problem the question of how far our knowledge and its forms match up with a reality that's external to consciousness. This epistemological standpoint, Lukács argues, reduces us to mere spectators of society. We think it's only problem to grasp it through predetermined forms. Lukács's problem with this isn't merely that the forms are wrong, rather it's this very attempt to separate subject, object and consciousness from one another. Whilst I won't be able to go into detail about Lukács's arguments about this in the reification chapter tonight, we can see the use of this term, or this particular use of the term, in the way he talks about the party and its role as an organizational form of the class. In the first place, Lukács's party essentially serves as the institutional form of proletarian class consciousness. Without such a party, and this is where he differs from Luxemburg, such consciousness would be formless and immediate. The proletariat needs to give itself an institutional form to its self-consciousness in order to understand itself properly. The party, as he puts it, is the form that the revolutionary proletariat gives itself. The leading sections of the working class are supposed to organize themselves. As he puts it, quote, "The organizational independence of the Communist Party is necessary in order that the proletariat can see its own class consciousness as a historical form, so that for the whole class, its own existence can be raised to the level of consciousness." Whereas a Blanquiste party would be there essentially to tell the workers what they ought to think, the Lukácsian party embodies the proletariat in its very organizational forms. Moreover, those forms aren't just a representation of something that's already there, a more or less accurate picture of an underlying substrate. Rather, Lukács states that the party is the proletariat's, quote, act of self-conscious becoming. It's only by taking on form for itself that the proletariat can really be said to become a class in a real sense. Furthermore, the close ties that Lukács establishes between form and existence indicate how reification could return as a problem in the organization of the party. Though tactical concerns play some role in organization, this should not result in the imposition of certain forms in the name of exigency. Rather, what's crucial is that forms come from the self-organization of the proletariat. As he put it, the emergence of the Communist Party can only be the consciously performed work of the class-conscious workers. As a result, organization is not a once-and-for-all action. Lukács is not trying to replace one set of abstract, quantifiable capitalist forms with another, more authentic or qualitative set of forms. To do so, he suggests, would be to risk the return of reification, which he also identifies as the fixing of organizational structures by party leadership. For Lukács, it's not so much what the party does that matters, but more the opportunities it provides for proletarians to become actively involved in shaping the forms of his existence. In his words, quote, "Insofar as the party becomes a world of activity for every one of its members, it can overcome the contemplativity of bourgeois man." To sum up then, Lukács identifies the party as the practical overcoming of reification. In his words, organization is the form of mediation between theory and practice. Like Luxemburg, he rejects a Blanquiste party that takes control on behalf of the workers. But he goes beyond Luxemburg in his insistence on some kind of institutional form which must remain fluid for proletarian consciousness, without which it would be vague and ineffective. De-reification, therefore, is necessarily practical. It means deliberate engagement in practices that give forms to one's own existence. The party is practical consciousness, the embodiment of such forms in a way that allows for their very transformation. Although Lukács's account rests very specifically on the conditions of the industrial working class and the phenomenological construction of proletarian self-consciousness, I think his fundamental concept of de-reified praxis can help inform progressive democratic organization nowadays. Even if we stay within the intellectual world of current social and political forms, the idea of reification can be used to critique universalist discourses of rights, which start from a fixed standpoint that makes it impossible to negotiate the boundaries of citizenship or group membership in any substantial way. More radically, though, Lukács's party provides a model for broad-based social action. Democratization would, for Lukács, entail much more comprehensive involvement in forming our social relations than just reformation of legal and political categories. I'd like to draw here creatively for a moment on the ideas of culture and practice that Andrew puts forward in his original interpretation of Lukács. We should understand social forms through the idea of practices, that is, as structured, repeatable interactions that acquire a certain significance or meaning within the totality of a culture. It's these practices that become reified, rather than seeing them as things that we do, things that are recharged with meaning only because we continue to practice them. We wrongly treat them as fixed and immutable. This might be because we've never encountered any other way of doing this. Social practices have always been this way and seem almost divinely sanctioned. Alternatively, as Lukács thinks is the case in capitalist society, we might come up with a supposedly scientific theory that explains such practices in terms of an eternal, unchangeable human nature that inevitably develops into specific social forms, such that we seem only able to interact through these set ways. Dereification would entail a deliberate transformation of these practices. We should, Lukács would argue, treat our practices as things that we can adapt to circumstances. We can't recreate social forms at will out of nothing, but at the same time, by recognizing that forms as practices are things that we do, we can open them to a steady transformation. At the suggestion of Surayan Mukherjee, I'd like to point to the alter-globalization model as an example of the sort of thing this might entail. Alter-globalists welcome the growth of global interaction and cooperation that current development has generated. However, they emphatically reject neoliberal ideas that such development can only take place in one way, determined by supposedly scientifically knowable economic processes. Alter-globalization therefore tries to develop alternative social practices. It's oriented towards a positive redefinition of social interaction, not an unthinking, reactionary rejection of internationalism. In other words, it focuses on the very question of whether or not our social practices are things we can have any control over. Lukács's model of the party also indicates ways such activity would need to be carried out. It must be a grassroots movement above all, with a deliberate orientation towards the problem of its own organization. That is, emancipatory movements shouldn't view themselves as instrumentally oriented towards merely attaining a particular end. Rather, they need to devote much of their energy to themselves and to shaping the ways in which they hold together as organizations. In doing so, they afford their members an opportunity for the very sort of dereified praxis that Lukács aspires to. A top-down leadership focused exclusively on achieving specific ends in the world would not represent real emancipation because it would still subordinate individual members to fixed forms of interaction. To sum up then, I've argued that Lukács's understanding of the Revolutionary Party aims to fulfill some of the emancipatory goals of Marx's On the Jewish Question. Rather than being a centralized cadre of professional vanguardists, Lukács's party is strongly influenced by Luxemburgian aspirations of grassroots self-organization. By interpreting the party as the conscious form of social relations, Lukács indicates the importance of some objective presentation of our practices if we're to understand our social existence properly. But he also suggests a new, dereified definition of praxis, the very act of self-organization, or of consciously modifying the practices that make up our social and cultural totality, is, for Lukács, the essence of revolutionary praxis. If we accept certain ways of interacting as eternal and unchangeable, we succumb to reification. Only by constantly struggling against the ossification of our practices into unchangeable forms can we hope for Lukács to be emancipated. Thank you.
Finally, our third panelist, Chris Catron.
The political origins of Frankfurt School critical theory have remained opaque, for several reasons, not least the taciturn character of the major writings of its figures. The motivation for such reticence on the part of the Frankfurt School critical theorists is itself what requires explanation. Why they engaged in self-censorship and encryption of their ideas and consigned themselves to writing messages in a bottle without immediate or definite addressee. As Horkheimer put it, the danger was in speaking like an oracle. He asked simply, "To whom shall we say these things?" It was not simply due to American exile in the Nazi era or post-World War II Cold War exigency. Some of their ideas were expressed explicitly enough. Rather, the collapse of the Marxist left, in which the critical theorists thought had been formed in the wake of the October 1917 revolution in Russia and the German Revolution and Civil War of 1918 to 1919, deeply affected their perspective on political possibilities in their historical moment. The question is, in what way was this Marxism? A series of conversations between the leaders of the Frankfurt Institute, Max Horkheimer and Theodor Adorno, in 1956, at the height of the Cold War and after Khrushchev's public admission of the crimes of the Stalin era, provide insight into their thinking and how they understood their situation in the trajectory of Marxism in the 20th century. Selections of the transcript, as was mentioned, were recently published in the New Left Review under the title Towards a New Manifesto. The German publication of the complete transcript in Horkheimer's collected works is under the title Discussion about Theory and Praxis. And their discussion was indeed in consideration of rewriting the Communist Manifesto in light of intervening history. Within a few years of this, Adorno began but abandoned work on a critique of the German Social Democratic Party's Godesberg program, which officially renounced Marxism in 1959, on the model of Marx's celebrated critique of the Gotha program that had founded the SPD in 1875. So especially Adorno, but also Horkheimer, had been deeply concerned with the question of continuing the project of Marxism well into the later post-World War II period of the Institute's work. In the series of conversations between Horkheimer and Adorno, recorded by Adorno's wife Gretel, from March to April 1956, Adorno expressed his interest in rewriting the Communist Manifesto along what he called strictly Leninist lines. Horkheimer did not object, but only pointed out that such a document calling for what he called the re-establishment of a socialist party could not appear in Russia, while in the United States and Germany it would be worthless. Nonetheless, Horkheimer felt it was necessary to show, quote, why one can be a communist and yet despise the Russians. As Horkheimer put it simply, theory is, as it were, one of humanity's tools. Thus, they tasked themselves to try to continue Marxism, if only as theory. Now, it is precisely the supposed turning away from political practice and retreat into theory that many commentators have characterized as the Frankfurt School critical theorists' abandonment of Marxism. For instance, Martin Jay in The Dialectical Imagination, or Phil Slater in his book offering a Marxist interpretation of the Frankfurt School, characterized matters in such terms. Marxism could not be supposed to exist as mere theory, but had to be tied to practice. But this was not a problem new to the Frankfurt Institute in exile, that is, after being forced to abandon their work in collaboration with the Soviet Marx Engels Institute, for example, which was as much due to Stalinism as Nazism. Rather, it pointed back to what Karl Korsch, a foundational figure for the Institute, wrote in 1923, that the crisis of Marxism, that is, the problems that had already manifested in the era of the Second International in the late 19th century, the so-called revisionist dispute, and developed and culminated in the collapse of the Second International and the division in Marxism in World War I and the revolutions that followed, meant that the, quote, umbilical cord between theory and practice had already been broken. Marxism stood in need of a transformation in both theory and practice, but this transformation could only happen as a function of not only practice, but also theory. They suffered the same fate. For Korsch in 1923, as well as for Georg Lukács in the same period, in writing seminal for the Frankfurt School critical theorists, Lenin, as well as Rosa Luxemburg, were exemplary of the attempt to re-articulate Marxist theory and practice. Lenin in particular, as Lukács characterized him, the theoretician of practice, provided a key, indeed the crucial figure in political action and theoretical self-understanding of the problem Marxism faced at that historical moment. As Adorno put it in the conversation with Horkheimer in 1956, quote, I have always wanted to develop a theory that remains faithful to Marx, Engels, and Lenin. So the question becomes, faithful in what way? Several statements in two writings by Horkheimer and Adorno's colleague, Herbert Marcuse, his 33 Theses from 1947 and his book Soviet Marxism from 1958, can help shed light on the orientation of the Frankfurt School critical theorists towards the prior politics of communism, specifically of Lenin. Additionally, several letters from Adorno to Horkheimer and to Walter Benjamin in the late 1930s explicate Adorno's positive attitude towards Lenin. Finally, writings from Adorno's last year, 1969, The Marginalia to Theory and Praxis and Resignation, restated and further specified the content of his Leninism in light of his critique of the 1960s New Left. The challenge is to recognize the content of such Leninism that might otherwise appear obscure or idiosyncratic, but actually points back to the politics of the early 20th century that was formative of Adorno and his cohort's historical perspective. Then the question becomes, what was the significance of such a perspective in the later period of Adorno's life? How did such Leninism retain purchase under changed conditions, such that Adorno could bring it to bear critically up to the end of his life? Furthermore, what could Adorno's perspective on Leninism reveal about Lenin himself? Why and how did Adorno remain a Marxist, and how did Lenin figure in this? One clear explanation of Adorno's Leninism was the importance of consciousness in Adorno's estimation of potential for emancipatory social transformation. For instance, in a letter to Horkheimer critical of Erich Fromm's more humane approach to Freudian psychoanalysis, Adorno wrote that Fromm demonstrated, quote, a mixture of social democracy and anarchism, and a severe lack of dialectics in the concept of authority, without which, after all, Adorno says, neither Lenin's vanguard nor the dictatorship can be conceived of. And then he says, I would strongly advise Fromm to read Lenin. Adorno thought that Fromm thus threatened to deploy something of what he called the, quote, trick used by bourgeois individualists against Marx, and wrote to Horkheimer that he considered this to be, quote, a real threat to the line which the Frankfurt Institute's journal has taken. But the political role of an intellectual, theoretically informed vanguard is liable to the common criticism of Leninism's tendency toward an oppressive domination over, rather than the critical facilitation of social emancipation. A more complicated apprehension of the role of consciousness in the historical transformation of society can be found in Adorno's correspondence on Benjamin's essay, The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction, in 1936. There, Adorno commended Benjamin's work for providing an account of the relationship of intellectuals to workers along the lines of Lenin. As Adorno put it in his letter to Benjamin, quote, the proletariat is itself a product of bourgeois society. The actual consciousness of actual workers has absolutely no advantage over the bourgeois, except interest in the revolution, but otherwise bears all the marks of mutilation of the typical bourgeois character. We maintain our solidarity with the proletariat instead of making our own necessity a virtue of the proletariat, as we are always tempted to do. The proletariat, which itself experiences the same necessity and needs us for knowledge as much as we need the proletariat to make the revolution. And then he goes on, I am convinced that the further development of the debate that you, Benjamin, have so magnificently inaugurated in the Work of Art essay depends essentially on a true accounting of the relationship of the intellectuals to the working class. Your essay, he says, is among the profoundest and most powerful statements of political theory that I have encountered since I read Lenin's State and Revolution. Adorno likely had in mind as well Lenin's What is to be Done, or even especially his post-revolutionary pamphlet Left-Wing Communism and Infantile Disorder. In the former, Lenin, somewhat infamously, distinguished between trade union and socialist consciousness. But in the later work, Lenin described the persistent bourgeois social conditions of intellectual work per se that would long survive the proletarian socialist revolution. Indeed, reiterating from What is to be Done, that workers became thoroughly bourgeois by virtue of the very activity of intellectual work, such as in journalism or art production, including and perhaps especially in their activity as Communist Party political cadre. For Lenin, workers' political revolution meant governing what would remain an essentially bourgeois society. The revolution would make the workers, for the first time, so to speak, entirely bourgeois, which was the precondition of their leading society beyond bourgeois conditions. It was a moment, the necessary next step, in the workers' own self-overcoming in the emancipatory transformation of society, in, through, and beyond capital. Marxism was not extrinsic, but rather intrinsic to this process, as the workers' movement itself was. As Adorno put it to Horkheimer, quote, it could be said that Marx and Hegel taught us that there are no ideals in the abstract, but that the ideal always lies in the next step, that the entire thing cannot be grasped directly, but only indirectly by means of the next step. Lukács had mentioned this about Lenin in a footnote to his 1923 essay in History and Class Consciousness, Reification in the Consciousness of the Proletariat, that, quote, Lenin's achievement is that he rediscovered this side of Marxism that points the way to an understanding of its practical core. His constantly reiterated warning to seize the next link in the chain with all one's might, that link on which the fate of the totality depends, in that one moment, his dismissal of all utopian demands, his relativism and his realpolitik, all these things are nothing less than the practical realization of the young Marx's theses on Feuerbach. But this was not fully achieved in the revolution that began to unfold from 1917 to 1919 in Russia, Germany, Hungary, and Italy, but was cut short of attaining the politics of the socialist transformation of society. 30 years later, in the context of the dawning Cold War following the defeat of the Nazis in World War II, Marcuse's 33 Theses tried to take stock of the legacy of the crisis of Marxism and the failure of the revolution. This is Marcuse. To uphold without compromise orthodox Marxist theory, in the face of political reality, such a position would be powerless, abstract, and unpolitical. But when the political reality as a whole is false, the unpolitical position may be the only political truth. He goes on. The political Workers' Party remains the necessary subject of revolution. In the original Marxist conception, the party does not play a decisive role. Marx assumed that the proletariat is driven to revolutionary action on its own, based on the knowledge of its own interests, as soon as the revolutionary conditions are present. But subsequent development has confirmed the correctness of the Leninist conception of the vanguard party as the subject of the revolution. It is true that the communist parties today are not this subject, but it is just as true that only they can become it. Only in the theories of the communist parties is the memory of the revolutionary tradition alive, which can become the memory of the revolutionary goal again. The political task, then, would consist in reconstructing revolutionary theory. As Marcuse put it later in 1958 in Soviet Marxism, during the revolution, beginning in 1917, it became clear to what degree Lenin had succeeded in basing his strategy on the actual class interests and aspirations of the workers and peasants. Then, from 1923 on, the decisions of the leadership increasingly dissociated from the class interests of the proletariat. The former no longer presuppose the proletariat as a revolutionary agent, but rather are imposed on the proletariat and the rest of the underlying population. Adorno's commentary in conversation with Horkheimer in 1956, in a passage not included in the New Left Review translation publication, titled Individualism, addressed what he called the problem of subjectivity as socially constituted, which he thought Lenin had addressed more rigorously than Marx. Adorno said that Marx was too harmless. He probably imagined quite naively that human beings are basically the same in all essentials and will remain so. It would be a good idea, therefore, to deprive them of their second nature. He was not concerned with their subjectivity. He probably didn't look into that too much. The idea that human beings are the products of society down to their innermost core is an idea that Marx would have rejected as milieu theory. Lenin was the first person to assert this. What this meant for Adorno was that the struggle to overcome the domination of society by capital was something more and other than the class struggle of the workers against the capitalists. It was not merely a matter of their exploitation. For it was not the case that social subjects were the products of their class position, so much as bourgeois society under capital determined all of its subjects in a historical nexus of unfreedom. Rather, class position was an expression of the structure of this universal unfreedom. As Horkheimer wrote in an aphorism titled The Little Man and the Philosophy of Freedom, one of his writings from 1926 to 31, published under the title Dammerung, in socialism, this is Horkheimer, freedom is to become a reality. But because the present system is called free and considered liberal, it is not terribly clear what this may mean. The businessman is subject to laws that neither he nor anyone else, nor any power with such a mandate created with purpose and deliberation. They are laws which the big capitalists and perhaps he himself skillfully make use of, but whose existence must be accepted as a fact. Boom, bust, inflation, wars, and even the qualities of things and of human beings the present society demands are a function of such laws, of the anonymous social reality. Bourgeois thought views this reality as superhuman. It fetishizes the social process. The error is not that people do not recognize the subject, but that the subject does not exist. Everything therefore depends on creating the free subject that consciously shapes social life, and this subject is nothing other than the rationally organized society which regulates its own existence. But for the little man, who is turned down when he asks for a job, because objective conditions make it impossible, it is most important that their origin be brought to the light of day, so that they do not continue being unfavorable to him. Not only his lack of freedom, but that of others as well, spells his doom. His interest lies in the Marxist clarification of the concept of freedom. Such a clarification that Horkheimer was calling for, of what would constitute a progressive emancipatory approach to the problem of capital, was cut short by the course of Marxism in the 20th century. It thus also became increasingly difficult to, quote, bring to the light of day the origins of persistent social conditions of unfreedom. In many respects, the crisis of Marxism had been exacerbated, but not overcome as a function of the post-World War I revolutionary aftermath. This involved a deepening of the crisis of humanity, as the Frankfurt Institute critical theorists were well aware that fascism as a historical phenomenon was due to the failure of Marxism. Fascism was itself the ill-begotten offspring of the history of Marxism. From a decade after the 1917 revolution, Horkheimer wrote in a passage entitled Indications that, and this is Horkheimer, the moral character of a person can be infallibly inferred from his response to certain questions. In 1930, the attitude toward Russia casts light on people's thinking. It is extremely difficult to say what conditions are like there. I do not claim to know where the country is going. There is undoubtedly much misery. The senseless injustice of the imperialist world can certainly not be explained by the technological inadequacy. Anyone who has the eyes to see will view events in Russia as the continuing painful attempt to overcome this terrible social injustice. At the very least, he will ask with a throbbing heart whether it is still underway. If appearances were to be against it, he will cling to this hope like the cancer patient to the questionable report that a cure for his illness may have been found. This Horkheimer continues. When Kant received the first news of the French Revolution of 1789, he is said to have changed the direction of his customary stroll from then on. Despite what occurred in the unfolding of developments in 20th century history, Horkheimer and Adorno never reversed course. Are we yet ready to receive their messages in a bottle?
And finally, we'll go to Nicholas Brown for a response.
Thanks. Can you hear me without the microphone? No? It's awfully muddy sounding from up here. So I'm in the unenviable position of having largely agreeing with what I heard this evening and don't have anything sort of scandalous to say. It does seem to me that these three papers are essentially sort of raising the same question, although not explicitly. So that's the question I'm going to essentially ask, maybe in different language, to each of the three panelists. I confess I never got through the Adorno-Horkheimer dialogue precisely because of the Beckettian flavor of it, which I just find annoying. But now I find it funny that you put that name to it. But they're obviously sort of dealing with an impossibility there, which is how are you going to have somehow be some sort of fidelity to Lenin without a party, without a viable party to affiliate with, or without a concept of party that's operative. And of course, the question then becomes circling around the question of what is to be done when there's nothing to be done. And so, this is a sort of comic version of it in this dialogue, and I think I stopped reading about at the motorcycle, the anal motorcycle. But there's a tragic version too, which is the beginning of the of negative dialectics, where Adorno, sort of knowing full well what he's doing, throws in his lot with the Stoics and sort of frames his own position as essentially a Stoic position, knowing better than anyone, or as well as anyone, that the entire sort of ethics isn't quite the right word, but the entire sort of ethical force of phenomenology of spirit and Hegel, something that in this sense Marx certainly inherits, is the impossibility or the deep complicity of the Stoic position with everything that's wrong. So another part of this sort of equation is the question of the sort of self-inflation of their language that goes hand in hand with a certain sort of self-hatred at the same time. And of course, we recognize that also from phenomenology of spirit as the moment of the unhappy consciousness, who's always sort of oscillating between these two positions precisely for the same reason as Adorno, because their unhappy consciousness is sort of incapable of, in the words of Chris, quoting, I think, Lukács, seizing the next link, because there is no visible next link. Again, the problem of the party. So that brings us to the question of party and Lukács, the next question. But I guess my question for Andrew is, what do we do? What is to be done without a party? And there is an answer towards the end. I'm not sure if it's an answer, or is it merely a sort of a speculative alternative that sort of turned to Marcuse at the end of your paper. The question of party and Lukács, of course, I think what Richard did so interestingly was to show that that's not so much, or at least in the first part of his paper, is that party is not so much a thing yet, or thing necessarily, as it is a concept. In other words, the party is that thing that mediates between the subject and history. In other words, the party is an institution, and it can look like a whole lot of things. It doesn't have to look like a party. So the moment that we sort of deny epistemology, the moment we deny ontology, the moment we deny Kant, the moment we deny representation, both as a philosophical and a political concept, we are in this Hegelian universe, and there becomes an obligation to find in one language the party, in another language the next link, in another language simply a mediation. But whatever it is, there's an obligation to find that next link, and it's that obligation that Adorno finds himself unable to fulfill, and that's both the comedy and tragedy of Adorno. So my question for you is the same question, and that is, what does the party look like, the philosophical concept of the party look like today? And again, at the end of your paper, there's a kind of an answer that begins to look a little bit like a sort of autonomist Negrian sort of answer. I'm sort of curious if that's the case, because then, that seems to be not a satisfactory solution if that is it, because again, it falls prey to a very old critique. Hegel, again, was waiting for Hart and Negri as well, which is that, of course, even within a single subject, there are multiple desires, and those desires don't add up to a decision. A subject has to make the decision, and of course that subject is a fiction, but nonetheless that fiction is necessary. Something like a party is necessary. And so with Chris, I think the idea, let's see, this one of the sort of strands I wanted to ask you to bring out a little bit more is that what seemed to me in Marx, in Lukács, certainly in Adorno, certainly in Marcuse, to be a sort of, maybe it's a tension, maybe it's not, I wasn't sure from your talk. To me it seems like a tension, or two strands that maybe don't add up, and maybe one can be abandoned entirely, between this notion of universal unfreedom, right? In other words, towards the idea that after the revolution, everyone is liberated, and the notion of exploitation, which in our present moment has to do with fragility and who is not protected from the winds of history, which is not quite the same question as universal unfreedom and disalienation. And I think one possible answer, perhaps not yours, that's the part I was sort of looking for clarification on, that the notion of disalienation, the sort of romantic side of eruptions here and there in Marx, here and there in Lukács, but more and more in the Frankfurt School, is what needs to be abandoned towards a more sort of hard-headed concentration on the second of those two sides. But very much like the idea of bringing out in the Frankfurt School this idea of the ideal is the next step. What the what the Hegelian idea means in the present is the next step, the next link in the chain. And it's the same question as I asked of the first two, and that is, what is the next link in the chain?
So we'll briefly give the panelists a chance to respond to each other, to Nick's provocations. So why don't we go the same order as before? Andrew.
That's a difficult question.
Meant to be.
Yeah. What I like about Marcuse was that he was able to separate two things which, for Marx and Lukács and Lenin, were essentially connected. And one of those things was the subject of revolution, and the other was the force able to de-reify at least some portions of the social reality. In the classical Marxist conception, the two things go together. If it's the workers who de-reify by their refusal to submit passively to the forms in which their lives are cast, and it's also the workers who are going to create the new society. And I think what Marcuse realized was that you could have one without the other. You could have the first without the second. You could have de-reifying gestures and express solidarity with them and articulate them theoretically without any confidence at all that those who were making those such gestures were capable of overthrowing the society and creating a new society. Now, you'd have to get beyond the stage of a few bohemians who don't like the way things are going and smoke dope in order for this to make sense. But after the May events of 1968 in France, it was clear that we were well beyond that stage, that a new, historically new type of opposition had arisen. And so I think he was right to try and join Marxist theory to that opposition. And I think that's still a significant alternative to the despair on the one side that you see in Adorno and Horkheimer, and on the other side, to attempts to revive traditional Marxist proletarian party.
Richard?
Yeah, I think I'd have a twofold response. First of all, I think my answer to what's to be done is that it's not really our place to say. And I think that would be Lukács's response. I think the critique that Lukács is trying to put forward is that there are, in a sense, too many people like us standing up and attempting to kind of lead. And what the party, what he sees in something like the party, is the opportunity for a much more broad-based movement than might hitherto have been possible. I think the party, or any form of organization, rather than being viewed as the instrument by which something gets done, is more to be seen as the way in which the multiplicity of wills become not necessarily one, but at least learn to think of themselves as united. And again, not so much through the specific decisions to which they come about practical action, but more about the kind of self-organization, the institutional forms they give themselves. And I think that would lead to kind of the second aspect that I'd stress in response. I think Lukács's critique of Hegel, and indeed bourgeois philosophy in general, I think stems from this this idea of a subject. I mean, precisely the sort of thing he's often criticized for doing himself. This idea that we should conceive of action as a subject acting on a world and then kind of recognizing itself. I think what he sees in the party is the entity, if I can use such an ontologically reifying term, the entity that is a subject insofar as it manifests itself objectively through its organizational forms, and that's a slightly different thing from conceiving of the party as the agent or the thing that's going to go out and act. Thanks.
Chris, thanks.
I wanted to say a couple of things. I think that I was very happy with Andrew and Richard's addressing the question of theory and practice, and it came up, but I'd like to sort of draw out this idea of mediation, right? Because I think that what we're discussing with respect to political parties, etc., political form, because I think that Richard underlined the concept of form. In other words, that the party is a form. That when that is raised as an issue, then what we're talking about is the party as mediation, as a kind of mediation of theory and practice, a mediation of subject and object positions, if you will. To respond on the question of universal unfreedom and disalienation versus exploitation, and in the present context, I suppose that the term that floats around is precarity, right? Fragility in the system. And the notion of the Hegelian ideal as the next step, as Horkheimer and Adorno articulated in the conversation on rewriting the Communist Manifesto, I would sort of offer something, I would speculatively, in other words, not literally, but rather speculatively, about the relationship of theory and practice for Marx and the situation. I think that Andrew underscored the difference between the early Marx and the late Marx. I think that, Andrew, what you pointed out was the fundamental ambiguity of the late Marx with respect to the way he conceived of philosophy as a young man. But I would sort of argue that, in fact, the question of mediation sort of recurs. I would situate Marx's later work, the Critique of Political Economy, not just as an analysis of bourgeois forms, but rather as an analysis of the incipient consciousness of the workers' movement. In other words, that the workers' movement itself inherited classical political economy, that kind of bourgeois critical consciousness, but in a sort of later moment when the thought of the bourgeoisie itself had grown vulgar. Right, so one of the things that Marx does is he commends Adam Smith for being willing to sort of present society as self-contradictory, right? And in other words, that I think the way he puts it is that Smith's attempt to raise society to the level of consciousness was itself the critique of bourgeois society already. In other words, that sort of inherent critical aspect to the attempt to raise social conditions to self-awareness. And so I would sort of situate the question of, what is the next step? With respect to the question of the critique of capital. In other words, how would one re-articulate, because I think in Marx's own lifetime, what you had was a sort of meeting, like if you think of Marx's own political practice, the meeting of his theoretical critique of capital, which is this sort of Hegelian attempt to raise social form to the level of self-consciousness, to working class militants who were coming up against certain very determinate obstacles in their political practice in the wake of the failures of the revolutions of 1848. And that in other words, that there was a sort of a meeting, if you will, to put it back in Adorno's sort of more traditional terms, of the intellectuals and the workers around the question of what's the purchase of the critique of capital. I think that one of the things that we suffer from today is a couple of things. One is the sort of post-60s, there was a kind of return to Marx. There was a sort of return even to the Hegelian Marxism with respect to the critique of capital. But there was this sort of, in a sense, I would sort of push back a little bit on the idea that it's not for us to say. Like, in other words, if we were to describe ourselves as intellectuals, then the idea that it's not for us to say, well, the very point would be, how can these ideas find traction? In other words, as a meeting point. In other words, not as a set of instructions, right? But as a sort of cross-fertilization of theory and practice. That's why I pointed out the umbilical cord being broken. That Korsch sort of says, okay, the crisis of Marxism threatens that the umbilical cord between theory and practice is broken, but that means that these two things are two separate things. In other words, I would stress mediation in the concept of form rather than the liquidation of theory and practice in a concept of form or in a concept of party, etc.
Okay, so we're going to open this up to general questions. You can ask questions of any of the panelists, Nick included. And we're going to take one question at a time so everyone has the opportunity to answer. Please keep questions as focused and short as you can. I may cut you off if you get too long. Okay, I see a question back there. I'm going to send a microphone back so for the recording, purposes of recording.
Do you think the lights could be raised a little in the hall so we can see the people who we're talking to?
Not a bad idea.
Is this on? Yeah, okay. Thank you for the panel. Nick spoke to one of my points, but I will kind of hit on it again anyway, and then I'll make a separate point that will maybe be a little more scandalous. First is, if we are not in a position, if we as Marxists, communists, or would-be radicals, revolutionaries, are not in a position to speak, then it seems to me the problem we have is, what do we have to do to ourselves, for ourselves? What kind of investigation do we have to do in order to make ourselves into those who could speak? You know, let's say, I mean, does that make sense? I mean, it seems every great revolutionary, we often read about their later writings after they were successful, but Lenin, Mao, their first works are works of investigation amongst the people. So, I mean, I think we need to take that seriously. I read the dialogues, and I finished, and I think what sustained me, though, wasn't so much what they were saying, but what they weren't saying. And I was particularly interested in how this 1956 dialogue was policed by, well, it's Horkheimer mainly, but I wasn't so interested in just that, although that may be significant as well, but how it's the specter of Chinese Mao starving the peasants that is what is policing that dialogue. I think as philosophers in a room here, we should be aware of how we can be really brilliant on some things and really full of shit and really superficial in our analyses of other things. The educator needs to be educated too. Horkheimer was certainly not alone in attributing the deaths in the Great Leap Forward to Mao and Stalin is top down. But it's just anyone who studies that moment history from a contemporary standpoint has got to know that narrative is very simplistic. I recommend the writings of
sir, can we...
No, the point is...
Let's finish up.
No,
Thank you.
The point is that I think it's very interesting to think about, what if instead of putting their messages in a bottle, Horkheimer and Adorno had sent their messages to China, and not so prematurely written off that actually existing revolution at that time. And I mean that it's a provocation, but I seriously think that that's something that we need to be thinking about today, too, in our orientation towards actually existing practice in the world.
Mm-hmm. So the intellectuals and what they can do to transform themselves, and the question of China in 1956.
And Richard, that row, if we cannot speak,
someone wished to begin.
Directed at you. So.
No, I don't think that there's a prohibition on speaking so much, but it depends whether we're speaking ex cathedra or from within something else. I think one of the very, very few things I agree with Habermas on is his insistence that when we're talking about these things, we have to participate on an equal level with everyone else. I think the danger for people in our situation is to come along. I mean, it's a danger that Lenin himself noted when he was confined and ill in his final years, and wrote these furious letters demanding that the party should stay as far away as possible from the Soviets, because having an intellectual on what was likely to happen was all these sort of honest workers and peasants would look and would either be intimidated or look in awe, obviously, at the wise man from Moscow, and would simply do what they were told. And I think what we should do to be able to speak then is deny who we are, if anything. I mean, I think that's always the danger for anyone speaking with any badge of authority, that it leads to this kind of leadership problem where precisely the sort of freedom that that people like Marx envisage gets sidelined because of this. I'm not really qualified to speak on China, so I'll step back and let someone else.
I'm not sure I agree, because there aren't any ignorant peasants anymore. So
Nobody's scared of us. Quite the contrary.
And the people who are most vociferous in opposing any kind of intellectual authority are themselves intellectuals. So that's just another theory. So I don't know that there's a problem, really. It's more a question of is there anyone who's willing to listen, rather than are we perhaps oppressive in putting forward our views. That's anyway my conclusion from having participated in the good old days in many struggles over this question of authority.
Right. I think that I would say that in terms of the self-transformation of intellectuals, I don't know that it's a problem of who's speaking, but rather what's being said. And so, I would sort of introduce, another kind of Leninist category, namely tailism, right? That, there is, in a sense, a problem of articulation of historical consciousness and empirical realities. I wanted to sort of return to an issue that was raised by both Andrew and Richard that I thought was very helpful with respect to reification, like specifying what Lukács meant by reification, and situate it still yet further by saying that Lukács' critique of reification was really about the crisis of Marxism. In other words, that what Lukács meant by reification was the Second International, was the socialist workers' movement as it had become constituted in that historical juncture. And that's where he's sympathetic with Luxemburg, because Luxemburg is a critic, has a critique of that party form, and that's where the critique in the mass strike pamphlet, comes in with respect to the stage in history at which social democracy found itself, such that it became an impediment to the workers' movement, or it became a kind of obstacle to the workers' movement in, I would say, a kind of subject-object dialectic. In other words, that the workers' movement had itself generated itself historically into an object of self-critique. Now, the problem with, why is Horkheimer afraid of China? Because it's the apparent revolutionary success of what they considered to be counter-revolution, namely Stalinism. And in other words, having lived through the 30s and living through the transformation of Marxism in Stalinism, to see Stalinism flourish as the Marxism of the post-World War II period, they could only regard as a sign of the regression of Marxism itself. Now, why didn't they send their messages in a bottle to intellectuals in China? Because it would have been a surefire way of getting those Chinese intellectuals executed on the spot. Absolutely, man. Because it would have been bourgeois deviationism. Maybe not in 1956, but maybe in 1967, right? Now, we could say that, in other words, we could just read the statements about the Chinese prima facie, and say, oh, well, they must have some kind of anti-Chinese bias. They must not know what's really going on. And, perhaps that's the case, but the content of it, in other words, there's a dialectic there. I think that Horkheimer in the conversation says something like, well, what about the fact that 20 million Chinese are going to die, but after that there won't be any more starving Chinese? Right? Like, in other words, he puts it that way. He puts it as, what do we make in the face of that? And, looking back historically, we might say that for Horkheimer and Adorno, the fact that China had to undergo the kind of transformation that it underwent in the revolution, in the Great Leap Forward, that attempt to sort of extricate oneself from the imperialist global system and being on your own, then the imperialists are like, who cares, right? And of course are willing to blame the victim for what happens. That for Horkheimer and Adorno, what was always present to mind was that that historical path need not have been the case. In other words, that the success of the revolution that had opened in 1917, had it spread to Germany, had it spread beyond, would not have made such a revolution in China with the sacrifices it entailed and the calamities it entailed necessary. Right? And that becomes the image of emancipation then is what they're really concerned with. In other words, where you are essentially confusing, right, the struggle for emancipation for conditions of barbarism. In other words, they would have understood China as subject to a global system of barbarism such that this happens. Right? It's not about like demonizing the Chinese. It's rather about what happens when this becomes the model of socialism.
Nick, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, a couple of things, just quickly, because I think I'm sure we have other questions out there, but the first thing has to do with the place of intellectuals. And obviously, you know, when there's a mass movement, the situation of the intellectual is both much easier and much more difficult. Because it's easy because you know what to do. It's difficult because that thing is sort of hard, which is the sort of project of transformation, self-transformation that you're talking about. The problem we face is a different one, which is what do you do when there is no mass movement? And in so much as there is a mass movement, it's a totally, corrupt right-wing one. And there the issue is somewhat different. And I would say that it's not a question of the authority we have vis-a-vis non-intellectuals. It's the authority we have vis-a-vis each other. In other words, we are, not all of us, but many of us in this room have institutional affiliations. We operate in a massive institution that is, whether we like it or not, and we may very well not like it, but it is our link to the social. It is the lever that we have on the gear of the social. It's a small one, but everyone's a small one. Lawyers and ditch diggers don't have more of a gear handle than we do. Is in what do we do with our specific authority that can move that gear incrementally or usefully or at least plausibly. I mean, really all that Hegel demands is a plausible hand on a gear. And I think we have that, and I can go on at length, but I don't think that would interest anyone right now. The other thing is just just to clarify what Joe was in the back was saying, is that Adorno very clearly throws his lot with the West. And it's not so much a matter of literally getting it out to actual Chinese dissidents. It's a matter of the question of, did Adorno have to that clearly throw his lot in with the West and that clearly sever links with actually existing socialism? And I think that question is a little less clear cut than whether it would have been a good idea to sort of have Chinese dissidents parroting the Adornian line. Yeah, and that's what I just clarifying your point.
Okay, let's make sure we get more questions out here. How about this gentleman in the University of Chicago sweatshirt here?
This is a question about the way in which Kant relates to Lukács. Kant, of course, is noted for being the first person to demand that we think in a way politically, in that we're forced to comment on society as members of that same society without regard for specific circumstances. And of course, it is because we are obligated to participate in continuing development of society. Lukács, I would argue, sees that only through the party can the society continue developing, and therefore the question of individual responsibility on history is somewhat misplaced. It's only the party that, having the ability to shape history, can ever have an obligation to think about history. I think this is sort of motivating Lenin and Luxemburg when talking about crises in the party. The reason Luxemburg is so worried about the vote in the Reichstag Parliament about the war credits is because it shows the decline of the party and need to reconfigure the party to affect history.
So if I can rephrase, or at least some of, I think the issue is the relationship between sort of individual party history and how these all played out in the crisis moment of the Second International that came up in a lot of people's talks.
I think I'd start by disagreeing. I don't think Lukács thinks the party can change history. He thinks the class can change history. The party brings the class about. The party might be the starting point, but it's not, emphatically not the end point. To say the party changes history directly would give it the kind of heroic role that I think Lukács is trying to get away from. Because if you say the party can change history, that's very easy to reduce to the leader can change history. All it is a way for the class as a whole to make itself subjective, I think.
I think that I would sort of say that, the political party or the political mediation, the agency of political mediation, can't itself, right, emancipate society. However, it can certainly block that emancipation, right? And so that, in other words, thought of negatively. In other words, that the importance of the party question is really a negative one with respect to, and I think that this is where I'm more in sympathy with the idea that historical consciousness is meant, like in Luxemburg's critique of the SPD in its kind of political collapse, is meant to be kind of to charge the party with responsibility for history negatively. To sort of say, this party has brought history to this point in the sense of what needs to be overcome, that the party in a sense is tasked with a kind of self-overcoming in its form of mediating political agency. Right, so that it's not important in a positive sense so much as in a negative sense, in the sense of something to be recognized, right, as the sort of objectification of political practice.
Some more questions. We have a gentleman in the back over there.
Okay. Two quicks. One is I find the Lenin described, mediated through Adorno and through Lukács, completely unrecognizable from the Lenin of the collected works. But what I recognize as being described as Lenin in Adorno and Lukács is the resolution of the Second Congress of the Comintern and of the Third Congress of the Comintern on the role of political parties in the proletarian revolution, which is a collective product. It's not Lenin. It's actually primarily authored by Gregory Zinoviev. Yeah. And encapsulates a false history of the Bolshevik Party, a history of the Bolshevik Party which projects back the character which the Bolshevik Party assumed between 1918 and 1921 under the Civil War conditions, onto the prehistory of the Bolshevik Party before 1917. That's the one historical question. And the other is simply that the stuff about party, the question about party, goes a lot further back in Marx. That there is comment about that the working class needs to form itself into a political party, antagonistic to the political parties of the bourgeoisie. In Marx and Engels, consistently from the 1840s through to Engels' death, with a brief interlude in the period of the First International when they were in alliance with the Proudhonists and therefore not talking about the party question. But at the end, in 1871, the working class cannot act. The Hague Congress resolution, the working class cannot act except by forming itself into a political party. So it's already there. And I'm not sure that the explanations which are being offered by Hegelianizing, by making Marx more Hegelian, provide satisfactory account of that political aspect of Marx and Engels' interventions.
Can I ask for a clarification? What you would say the difference is between, specifically, right, between the Lenin that you would recognize and the Lenin of sort of official Comintern Leninism, and maybe that difference as the difference that you then raise between Marx himself and his own political practice, or Marx and Engels, and the sort of Hegelian Marx, the Hegelianized Marx that you find in Lukács and Adorno.
Okay, it's the party of the whole class versus the party of the advanced minority, in the sense that it's in the theses of the Second and Third Congresses that the proposition is advanced that the party cannot fuse with the class. In all previous Marxist thought, The idea is that it may well be the case that you start with a minority, but your project is that the party and the class will fuse, and that the party will simply become the instrument through which the class organizes itself. In the thesis of the second and third Congresses of the Comintern, that is denied. It said the party must always be a minority, and precisely the party, Lukács's arguments, the party must always be a minority because of the reification effect of capitalist society.
If I could just start off, and then I'm sure you guys have something to say. I would say, and this is just a kind of plug for a talk that I'm going to give tomorrow at the panel that we're doing in the afternoon on the Marxism of the Second International Radicals, that Lenin has a specific sort of contribution in the history of Marxism that can't be ignored, namely that he's the great schismatic of Marxism. In other words, he divided Marxism. And that I would argue that this is precisely what esteems him in Adorno's eyes. I don't think that it's a minority kind of vanguard view, but it is about politics in the working class. In other words, that what Lenin introduces in a way that was not clear in the Second International is the idea of competing working class parties that all claim to be anti-capitalist and revolutionary, and even claim to be Marxist. In other words, political controversies within Marxism itself. That's what the crisis of Marxism refers to, that I cited from Korsch, and I think Richard also cited, that in a sense, to deny that is in a sense to say that politics is only the workers versus the capitalists, and it's not a sort of infra-working class phenomenon. And I think that in that respect, the kind of Kautskian party, the one class, one party, in other words, the vis-a-vis the capitalists, the workers are one of one interest, as the attempt to sort of be the party of the whole class, not in a literal sense of including the entire working class, but rather to assert the sort of unity of the working class's interests, is to deny that the content of political emancipation can be disputed among the workers and among Marxists, and that might take the form of parties competing with each other. In other words, a properly political phenomenon.
I'm partially sympathetic to, I'm not sure I understood, but I'm partially sympathetic to what you're saying. It seems to me that the position Lenin took could not be easily explained or justified in terms of Marxist theory. And that what someone like Lukács was engaged in doing in 1923, or Gramsci in the prison notebooks, was an attempt to ground that practice in Marxist theory by finding the missing link. And I mean, there are many different statements in Lenin, in his early work, that don't add up to a theory of what he was doing. But he knew what he was doing, there's no doubt about that, and it had a significance historically that Chris has just explained. So the question could be asked separately from the historical facts of whether, Lenin was doing the right things in terms of Marxist theory. These people, like Lukács, recognized that he had done something historically important and tried then to figure out how to revise the theory or interpret the theory in such a way that it could encompass what Lenin had done. And that's, of course, a questionable procedure, but it's also fruitful, because I think that Lukács, for example, did make an important advance theoretically in terms of understanding how there could be a connection between the working class and Marxist theory, and through Marxist theory to political parties that represent workers, how there could be a connection grounded in a kind of ontological relation, a relation to reality that would be shared at different levels in different ways between these different instances of the movement. And that's a very important theoretical idea I don't think you can find in Marx or Engels or in Lenin, but it's necessary to make sense of what happened historically.
I think I just want to pick up and actually endorse some of the things as well that Chris was saying. I mean, from the perspective of Lukács, this, I mean, Lukács is very clear that he wants the party ultimately to grow into a mass-based movement. But in the interim, he explicitly states in his the essay on party organization, every different school, every different take on the very question of what the party should do, he says needs to give itself organizational forms. So he's all for a very broad pluralist, I think, sprouting of different practices to which I think undermines an idea of a single concentrated vanguardist party. I think it's something that has to have as much participation as possible. It doesn't necessarily need to be one monolithic form of participation. I mean, that might risk radical sectarianism, but at least it avoids reification, I think, from Lukács's perspective.
Just one sentence. That, I mean, there's the distinction between whether they're not irrelevant to each other, but whether Lukács and Adorno got Lenin right is actually not the same question, and is usefully distinct from the question of whether that concept of Lenin was a politically useful, politically interesting, and what is to be done with it today. And just quickly, I'm not sure what the Hegelianization of Marx has to do with that question, but you can't Hegelianize Marx because Marx is more Hegelian than Hegel.
Okay, looking for more questions. There's a question all the way up front here, the gentleman in the orange. 1 second, wait for the microphone, please.
This is primarily for Chris, but anyone can chime in if they want. I take the primary thrust of your argument to be that Adorno is a Leninist, and in the way that you address the dialogue is to use that to support that argument, that the content of the dialogue supports that Adorno is a Leninist. The comedic nature of the dialogue, which has already been addressed, seems to undermine that argument in that specific case. You make many other arguments that are very strong, but that one in particular seems to be somewhat weak. And given that you're a very intelligent man and you made that argument anyway, it seems to imply that you want Adorno to be Leninist in some fashion. And I just take, between the lines, and maybe I'm, not giving you full credit on this, it seems that you want to enlist Adorno in this essentially Leninist project of reconstituting the left. And I'm curious as to, for you, what the utility of Adorno being a Leninist is.
Well, I would sort of turn the question around a little bit. In other words, I would say that, well, first of all, on the question of comedy, right, I would say, Lenin was never lacking in a sense of humor, right? In other words, we have to sort of resist the sort of Stalinized Lenin, the kind of, patriarchal Lenin, if you will, the Lenin of sort of authoritative wisdom, and kind of hard-headed realist and this kind of thing. So I'd resist that just at the level of Lenin himself. And so I'd say that, the humor that one finds, or even the risking of absurdity that one finds in the conversation recorded between Horkheimer and Adorno, these are longtime colleagues and friends who are, engaged in frank discussion, but purposeful discussion about the possibility of rewriting the Communist Manifesto. It ultimately doesn't come to anything, but it doesn't come to anything because they just sort of say, okay, it's just absurd, but rather they allow themselves to actually grapple with the absurdity of it in a very compressed way. I think that I don't know if it was Andrew who pointed out that kind of compressed. There's a kind of the note taking of Gretel. She's taking down the conversation. It's very sort of condensed and just sort of sketchy. Now, in terms of enlisting Adorno to a Leninist project, Adorno enlisted himself in the Leninist project, and that's clear. Right, he says so. He says, I want to be faithful to Lenin. Now, the whole question is, what's the content of that? Right? Because the content of that can't be assumed. He said that specifically when 99.99% of Leninists in the world would not have accepted that Adorno was in any way being faithful to Lenin. Right? So he enlisted himself into Leninism, but in a very peculiar way. And so I would sort of turn it around and say, that in a way I'm interested in the Lenin that becomes visible through Adorno. Right? In other words, in the regard that one can have for this earlier history. And I also think that when Adorno says a strictly Leninist manifesto, that's not like against Luxemburg or something, right? It is this kind of Lukács kind of attempt to grasp what the Second International radicals had in common. In other words, why Luxemburg called herself a Bolshevik, because she did. Right? And she wrote an essay in the last months of her life. What is German Bolshevism? What do we want? Why are we with the Bolsheviks? Right? So, in that respect, and of course, in a Marxist sense, that doesn't come without criticism. I think there's a great statement from Luxemburg's longtime collaborator, Leo Dziudzic, who was the kind of organizer of the Spartacus Bund, the group that Luxemburg was in. He was out of jail, she was in jail, and he was asked what he felt about the Bolsheviks in the October Revolution. And he said, Lenin and Trotsky are good comrades, but we remain Marxists. We remain critical. We would not be doing our comradely duty if we were uncritical, right? But it was comradely criticism. That's the point. And so, I'm interested in how this history of Marxism looks, specifically through Adorno's eyes, through Lukács's eyes, through Karl Korsch's eyes. And I think that it would be remiss for us to ignore the insights that they had into that history, because they do come later. They do come with the benefit of a historical experience that's otherwise not readily available.
Anyone else? Okay. There's the gentleman up front here. Go ahead. Microphone.
Hi. I was kicked out of my apartment and told to come here. I wasn't looking forward to this. I'm usually not too interested in intellectual discussions, but I've found this thoroughly enjoyable and informative and thought-provoking. And I think the most interesting part that I'm seeing is that Leninism is being broadened such that people that call themselves Leninists are quite often the most dull people in the world. And I think it's good that we're seeing Adorno considering himself a Leninist from a perspective that people don't normally look at. I just read a Lessons of October by Trotsky, and one of the things he points out, referring to Germany, is that we shouldn't look at the Soviets in a fetishistic way. So another thing I read by Trotsky in 32 rather, was him defending Luxemburg against Lenin, where she was correct and he was wrong. And he pointed out that Lenin wasn't Lenin. He wasn't always Lenin. He developed into Lenin. And when we look at Lenin, and I think Adorno is here, we have to look at the evolution of Lenin and see the embryonic, how he may have progressed if he had witnessed certain things. So I think this is a very interesting discussion, and I'm happy to be here. And my main thing is building a party today, and I think what I've seen here has given me some insights into it. So thank you.
Does anyone up here want to respond to that, or should we take another question?
I guess I'm feeling a little uncomfortable because I've I would hope that the kind of analysis that I'm making, the things that I've learned from studying Lukács and the history of revolutions and from my own experience, I would hope that that would be useful and interesting to people with very different views from my own. And I'm experiencing that now because I'm not, I don't see much interest personally in creating a party now and in Lenin's particular way of understanding how to do that. But this is a separate question from, the questions that we've been discussing. And I don't mind that people find that a good path. I'm just not in agreement with it. I think that in this moment in history, we know so little about the forces of opposition and their potential and where they're going to come from next that we don't have the kind of theoretical basis and basis in practical experience that the socialist movement had at the time when these parties were formed and developed. So I guess I'm not in favor under favorable conditions, yes, but under present conditions, it seems to me that we need to hang loose and try and find sources of opposition and tensions around the reifying power of the institutions wherever they appear, even if they don't even they don't even appear to be political, but nevertheless they have this kind of demystifying force about them. And I think we would prematurely close things down to have a theory and a party that was trying to direct struggles. So, but this is my impression at this time.
I would say I would sort of like to kind of echo something that Andrew brought up, which is that I think that it would be, it all depends on, and I think that this is what came up, in fact, in a lot of the discussion, what's meant by a party. I think that, and the gentleman in the back raised the question of, which Lenin and the Comintern and the early congresses of the Comintern, and I'm kind of reminded of something from that history, which was the first sort of document that was produced on the organization of communist parties in the Third International. It's very early on. I don't know if it's from 1920. And I think that the first line of that is something like, the Russian party should not be a model. Which is interesting, and I think that it was co-written by Lenin and someone else. I think that there was a German communist who was involved in writing this. But that the first line was, it shouldn't be a model, is interesting, right? On the one hand. On the other hand, I have my own sort of reservations about the Heart Negri kind of moment that we're in with respect to movementism. And maybe, Andrew, I would say that on the one hand, that the formation of a party in a kind of recognizable type from history at the present moment would be a foreclosing. It would, in fact, result in a kind of sectarianism, which is what a lot of the left is beset with, one way or the other. On the one hand. On the other hand, I would sort of say that one of the things that we have as a legacy from the last upsurge of the left in the 1960s and 70s was a certain resistance to forming political parties. In other words, that there was a kind of an anti-party kind of bias because the party was seen as the road to Stalinism. And so I think that part of the discontinuity that we deal with historically, in other words, if we say the earlier socialist movement had an accumulated historical experience that allowed them a certain kind of purchase for their ideas and a certain object for reflection, then we have to say that for a generation, we've been denied that. And so we're left sort of saying, okay, something like a party, do we expand this kind of notion of form? I think that what Richard's pointing to in terms of the concept of form, I think is very important. I think that the danger is in sort of applying it too broadly, in sort of what I raised earlier, a kind of tailism, a kind of theoretical justification for what people are already doing. That's a danger that I would resist. At one end, at the other end, I think that I agree that it would be precipitous and sort of stillborn to try to implement a party in a kind of historical model kind of way.
Yeah, I think actually I'm going to side a little more with Chris here. I think this institutional memory point of a party is really crucial. I think it's something that's been sadly lacking. I mean, I'm from England, where trade unions have been annihilated since the 1980s, and I think that's led to a disastrous collapse in progressive thoughts. I mean, only today, my beloved countrymen were waving flags for a feudal institution. I think
the failure of 1649.
Yeah, God damn it! Bring back the levelers and So I think, and this is where I think I stressed the Luxemburgian elements in Lukács earlier. I think this is where he critiques Luxemburg rightly. The idea that a party can form this sort of institutional memory, and I think to address the point Andrew made about we don't really know what forces there are there. I think the act of forming parties or supporting the formation of parties is one of the ways I think we can kind of find out. I refer back to what I said earlier about Lukács, his insistence that every position should try and adopt organizational forms, should develop its own organizational forms. That's how we get to know. If we treat it just in a purely sociological question of let's go out and gather empirical data, I think we risk falling back into the same reified standpoint of just collecting facts and rather than engaging in practice. And so I think, the encouraging the development of parties, the development of institutional forms and so on in various ways is a way in which those oppositional forces can really come to be and can be manifest. I think without those, the forces end up being less coherent, less even aware of their oppositionalism.
Okay. The questioner had a question, which I found. Oh, all right. Other hands. I saw that hand over there, the lady in the gray.
As one of the few ladies, I thought I would chime in. From a practical standpoint, as a member of the ignorant peasantry, which I believe is alive and well, actually, although I wouldn't consider myself necessarily ignorant. But without a push for the formation of a party, without a strong stance on a need for leadership, how can we, on a practical basis, apply the things that these various theories, shall we say, to the working class, who the conditions that existed in the 50s and the 30s and the 20s are not what we have here today. We are faced with propaganda on a mass level, indoctrination, drug addiction, apathy, ignorance, poor quality of education. I mean, the list of problems within the working class goes on. And without leadership and without a party and an idea to stand behind, people don't know how to unite. And I come from Wisconsin, where there is a strong movement on, but the one thing that we're lacking is leadership, truly. And it's the propaganda machine, the elections that are rigged. We don't have democracy here. Without a party, without leadership, what hope do we have?
I think, if I may, I'd hesitate with some of the way you phrased some of that. You talked about applying theories to the working class, and I think that's a dangerous thing to do because it puts us up there as people talking about them down below. I think the leadership issue kind of strikes at that. And it was alluded to before, and I hate to say this, I think the Tea Party is quite successful at doing, I think what for all their obvious incoherencies and absurdities, one of the things that I think has made them so successful is the lack of a leader, or the dispensability of their totemic figures. I mean, okay, there are voices, there are the Palins and so on, but they're not in any way leaders. They're not. It's not simply the case that what Sarah Palin says the Tea Party will then do. I mean, there are a number of different, there are a number of different Tea Parties as well, different Tea Party factions, and I think one of the reasons they've been so successful in making what to us may look like preposterous claims is because there is this very widespread, diffuse, decentralized, yet nevertheless organized form to it. It allows people to articulate the problems that they put forward. I think, I think that's essential. I mean, what we think the problems are with the working class are not necessarily the problems that the working class think are the problems with that. And of course, there are all sorts of issues around that, and the kind of the issue of sort of false consciousness and so on. I think we need to be careful on both sides. Otherwise, we end up like something out of Foucault, these well-meaning reformers setting up prison systems to which end up training people to behave like good bourgeois citizens. I think we have to be careful at the other end as well. I think that's the danger that concerns me most personally.
I guess if we had a voice that people listen to, the way the Tea Party listens to Sarah, we'd be in better shape. So I'm not sure that the problem is, I think you've leaped over the problem. Of course, if we had a party that had authority and was listened to, we would be in a much better shape. But how do you get there? It's not enough to form a party and then go out and announce that here's the party. There's a whole process involved of establishing an ideology that is widely shared, that is widely understood, at least in some form, and concepts that people can use to understand their experience and that have to circulate. And this is the difficulty. We don't really have a clear idea how to reach the stage at which a party would actually speak for a large number of people, because we don't have this kind of ideological presence. Could a party generate that? Well, that would be the hope. That's what communist parties did in the old days, right? And the social democratic parties. They were the generators and the distributors of a common ideology that enabled them to lead. But when we tried this in the 1960s and 70s, the process involved in producing ideology tended to result in premature splits among people in these organizations that were trying to be parties. And so the result was not that every position have an organizational representation, but every person would have an organizational representation, or every three people. And that's not fruitful. Then you give a display of disagreement, and the issue becomes excluding the other guy who shares 99% of your ideas, but that 1% is really important. And so there's a dynamic that seemed to develop that was destructive and eventually led to the self-liquidation of the left. So somehow I'm not solving your problem. I'm trying to think about your problem, and I think we need to really work hard on this question of how do you develop and spread ideology without being caught in ideological struggles, internal ideological struggles that destroy any organizational potential that you might have had.
Can I just add that I feel that
Ma'am, really quickly, we really don't have a lot of time. I want to get to other people. I'm sorry. Please, let's finish up here, and then afterwards there's time to
I should just
discuss.
remind everybody we're going to have a chance to have these conversations more tomorrow. So
Yeah,
That's true.
all over
continue
the
into
weekend.
I would just say maybe I would take issue a little bit with, raising the specter of the Tea Party. I think that what works for the right can't work for the left. I think that there's a fundamental difference between the right and the left, that the right sort of thrives on incoherence in a way that the left can't. And so I would also say, rather kind of polemically or in a jaundiced fashion, that the Tea Parties are the true children of the New Left. In other words, when the Tea Party says we have no leader, I just think, man, they've really internalized a certain kind of 60s leftism and just ran with it.
They have Rush Limbaugh and they have Fox News and they have spokesmen who are capable of reaching a large audience. And we don't.
No, that's right. I mean, I agree. I mean, I was, like I said, that was rather polemical and rather jaundiced of me to say, but yet that is the sort of anti-leadership kind of ethos. It sort of gets my back up a little bit because I'm just like, oh, okay, they know how to parrot the doxa like anyone else. Because I do think that anti-leadership is a kind of doxa, a kind of, a kind of a common sense, if you will, that dare not be sort of called out. That just turns the whole question back. I think that where Richard was going with it was, what do we mean by leadership? And that the idea of theoretical leadership in the sense of theory that's applied is precisely something that the Marxist tradition really wanted to overcome. Like that's what they understood as a kind of bourgeois notion of theory or a bourgeois notion of epistemology. And that really, going back, I mean, I feel like Kant and Hegel got thrown under the bus a little bit as bourgeois philosophers, but I think that going all the way back to Kant, there was already the idea of a self-conscious practice. In other words, that it's not about the abstract application of theory to practice. And that already with Kant, in other words, I think that there's a continuity there between Kant and Hegel and Marx, that what you're trying to do is raise existing practices to self-consciousness, which is quite different from crafting a theory and applying it to reality.
This gentleman in the black has been waiting a long time. I'm going to take him last. We're going to give panelists time for closing remarks, and then there will be time to discuss today, tomorrow, etc. So, wait for the microphone, please.
I wanted to ask a question to Andrew, specifically how you see exactly Herbert Marcuse as one of the three founding contributors, or three major contributors to Frankfurt School critical theory, as in some sense operating a third way between, say, either what could be characterized as Adorno's Leninism or even Horkheimer's conservatism, in, as you put it, Marcuse's openness to the historical developments of the New Left. Because it seems as though that Adorno and Horkheimer were both open to it, albeit with different perspectives. And it remains unclear to me exactly how you see, say, Marcuse's role as a kind of intellectual figurehead of the New Left, even though, although his books were read, he wasn't particularly listened to, it seems, in retrospect, in comparison to, say, the Red Book, a Little Red Book by Mao, or other kinds of Marxist-Leninist ideologies in circulation at the time. So what are we to make of, in some sense, this other legacy of Frankfurt School critical theory, coming in some sense deeply associated out of engagement with the New Left, but also melancholic about that movement's own limitations and failures?
Well, that's a very interesting and complicated question. I mean, I think that Marcuse, of course, was not as widely read as the journalism of the time presented him to be. I mean, I remember before he came to France in 1968, they published an article in the newspaper, Marcuse, the guru of the students in revolt. And then 3 weeks after he'd left and the May Events was in full flower, the article in the newspaper was, "Who has read Marcuse?" And of course, the answer was nobody. So there is a celebrity phenomenon, right, which he didn't provoke. It was something that happened to him. It wasn't something he asked for. But apart from that whole question, which I think has been harmful to his reputation, actually, in the long run, there's the question of what theoretical contribution he was able to make by observing and sympathetically the New Left, not uncritically. He was quite critical of some aspects of the New Left. For example, what he thought of as his anti-intellectualism. But he was sympathetic to other aspects of the New Left and tried to theorize those aspects in a new concept of a revolutionary movement. And this is really important. What would it mean to have a revolutionary movement in a society that was so rich that you could not have a movement for land, peace, and bread? You couldn't have a movement based on union struggles that were illegal and suppressed and therefore immediately transcended simple issues of wage demands. And so in such a society, why would people bother to make a revolution, and what kind of revolution would they want to make? Those are real questions, and he posed them, and he felt that there were the beginnings of, traces of, hints of answers in the New Left, and I think that's correct. I think that the left still lives under the horizon of demands and dissatisfactions that emerged in the 1960s and 70s. Movements like environmental movements, feminist movements, many other kinds of protests that have emerged in areas, sort of remote areas of society, like medicine, for example, come under this kind of category. These categories elaborated in the New Left to articulate the new kinds of dissatisfactions. So I think this is the contribution Marcuse made. Adorno and Horkheimer did not contribute to that because they viewed the New Left as a rather minor blip on the horizon, and when it did things they didn't like, they decided, forget it, it was no good. And so they just have nothing to say that connects with their own actual historical experience at the end of their life, whereas Marcuse did have something to say. So I think he is very important, and I'm actually extremely puzzled by the eclipse of Marcuse's thought on the left and the rise of this new vision of the Frankfurt School as Benjamin, Adorno, and Horkheimer. Benjamin was scarcely involved, and they had very tense and difficult relations with these guys. Marcuse was one of the most important figures in the school for a very long time and made many contributions besides the things he did at the end of his life talking about the New Left. And yet he's read out of the Frankfurt School by intellectuals on the left today. That I find very, very strange. And to me it signifies a certain lack of political seriousness, that the people pass over the only guy who actually engaged with the kind of leftism that we are capable of today. That's strange. So that's my immediate reaction to your question. I do not, by the way, think that the Little Red Book had a widespread influence in the 1960s and 70s.
So maybe I think we should move on to just wrapping up comments. So maybe if, Nick, you want to start, and we'll just go down the line if we have any final words. No? All right. Andrew, do you want that to be your call for reconsidering Marcuse? Yeah. Richard?
No, I'd just like to conclude by responding to this problem of Marcuse and the lack of political seriousness, which I think kind of points to an issue that we've kept coming back to tonight. I think the reason for people like Adorno and Benjamin coming back is that much of the academic reception has been done in literature departments. It's been it's been done through cultural studies, and I think precisely as you say, because there's this lack of direct engagement and direct activity on the part of the people who are doing it. I think that's a problem. I think that's one thing that's emerged really from everything that's come up tonight. The kind of the importance of engagement and some form of practice, whether with some whatever degree of leadership one attributes to it, but some practical, thought out, theoretical or form of praxis is the crucial thing, I think.
I guess I would sort of end with a kind of bid for taking Adorno seriously as a political thinker and not just as a literary figure. Certainly in the Horkheimer-Adorno dialogue published in New Left Review, he does say, look, music and art is what I know, and that's what I write about. But he was being a little bit falsely modest because his career in the post-war German academic context was to make a very strong intervention in German sociology. The introduction of both American empirical sociological technique and the introduction of a Durkheimian approach as opposed to a Weberian approach to the question of modernity and of capital. And in his correspondence with Marcuse in 1969, in which there was some sort of bitterness around the controversies stirred up by the New Left, it's a very complicated sort of relationship with Horkheimer, Marcuse, and Adorno, in which Adorno was left in the unenviable position of having to defend Horkheimer when Horkheimer was making a lot of cranky remarks vis-a-vis the New Left, and also defend Habermas. It was Habermas, in fact, who had been more than anyone behind the kind of left fascism charge directed at the New Left, at the student left in Germany in particular. And so I think that, one of the things that Adorno said in that correspondence with Marcuse, when he sort of made the bid saying, look, it's the Institute, it's the same Institute, it's our old Institute. And Marcuse is like, how could you possibly claim that the Institute in the 60s in the Federal Republic of Germany is what it was in the 30s? And Adorno could only say, what about my books? Right? In other words, what about the books that the Institute's existence has allowed me to write? In other words, negative dialectics. The works on sociology, the publication of the positivist dispute in German sociology, the kind of critique of Popper, right? Popper, who was nothing if not an anti-communist, right? Who considered that there was a totalitarian tradition that stretched from Plato through Hegel to Marx, right? In a sense, Adorno was a sort of lone champion of Hegelian Marxism within German sociology. And he basically, made a plea to Marcuse, don't forget what I'm doing. It may not be much, but I'm doing something here. And so reading Adorno as a political figure, I think, is very important. And I think that, there were the problems of the crisis of the 1960s and the inadequacies of the left response as he saw them. He wrote, very cryptic, but still very interesting, and they can in fact be read and understood, writings towards the end of his life, not only negative dialectics, but also writings that were recently published in English within the past 10 years, The Subject and Object, Marginalia to Theory and Praxis, and Resignation, are powerful statements about and trying to, in a sense, keep alive the kind of insights that had been gained by an earlier Marxist tradition that we've been making reference to here, Lukács, Korsch, in the aftermath of the crisis of Marxism and the revolutions of the early 20th century. And so, I would defend Adorno against his devotees. Right. In other words, I would say that the Adorno that flies in the humanities, of which I'm a member, I'm in the art history department here, is a sanitized Adorno, is a depoliticized Adorno, is the Adorno with the Marxism screened out, or the Marxism turned into an ethical critique of society. Whereas, in fact, I think that Adorno has a lot more to say about the problem of theory and practice, and that has a political importance. Perhaps a little obscure, but is nevertheless politically important.
Okay, on that note, let's give a thank you to our panelists. And please join us for the panels the rest of the weekend, where hopefully these issues will cascade into a giant snowball.